Very excited to be here today to talk about a topic that is extremely exciting and evolving every day, and that's battery storage in Latin America and the Caribbean. I'm joined today by two experts in this field, Daniel Chacón from Fluence and Markus Vlasits from New Energy Charge and the Brazilian Storage Association. Just to get started, I'll go over a few housekeeping items, do a brief intro on AMI and an overview of where we see storage opportunities in the region. And then we'll turn it into a panel discussion with the two panelists. If we can move on to the next slide, please. Just for you guys that don't know AMI, we are a market research firm focused exclusively on Latin America. I personally lead the energy practice at the firm. We've been operating for nearly 30 years across all 30 countries, 30 plus countries in the region. We have 400 local subcontractors that help us collect on the ground intel and help our clients make market facing decisions in the region. If we move on to the next slide, please. These are some of the services that AMI provides. We go from competitive intelligence, so understanding what your competitors' strategies are, what their pricing is, their market share, to opportunity benchmarking, identifying the best opportunities in the region based on costs and returns and regulatory frameworks, as well as traditional market sizing, understanding what is the market demand for your products, what's the expected growth rate, and where you should focus your sales efforts. If we move on to the next slide, please. Here's some of our clients since 2007. It's a wide range of different groups, from Shell to Neste to Eden to consulting firms and renewable energy developers. We cover the entire spectrum of the energy sector, so from end users all the way towards OEMs and manufacturers, and in batteries as well. That includes battery cell manufacturers to the IPPs that sell electricity to end users. If we move on to the next slide, please. These are just two brief announcements that I think is relevant to our audience today. Here to the left is a battery storage infographic we developed for Latin America and the Caribbean. It's filled with data, filled with interesting insights based on our several years of experience in the storage space. I highly recommend downloading that with your phone and having that as a reference point on storage. And here to the right, we actually partnered with Solar Media in this webinar. They're having an in-person event in Santiago, Chile. It's the third edition of the energy storage in Latin America. It's a great event. Both Daniel and I were present last year. It's in October. Here's a discount code, AMI20 for 20% off. We hope you join us in October. If we move on to the next slide. So here we go on into an overview of storage in the region. Storage is still very incipient in most countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. Chile really is the only country with significant installed operational capacity in Latin America and the Caribbean. There's a few other countries that are starting to make strides, but Chile is definitely the front runner and is charting the path for other countries to follow. If you move on to the next slide, please. There's quite a lot of content here, and we'll share this presentation to all of you that are participating, so you can read it in your own time. But the bottom line is that there's three main markets in which front of the meter battery storage is actually making significant strides. That's Chile, like I mentioned, Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico. Chile passed a storage law in the end of 2022, which essentially made standalone storage and hybrid projects feasible. There's very large energy spreads in Chile. It's actually the market with the second largest spreads in the world when it comes to storage, just behind ERCOT in Texas. It also is expecting a capacity payment in Q3 or Q4, which we'll talk a little bit more about in our panel. But that capacity payment will provide a contracted revenue for different energy operators in the country. Puerto Rico, Puerto Rico is less of a regulatory framework for storage and more of a market incentive. So the Puerto Rico Energy Board, PREB, approved a plan to accelerate storage and deploy around 360 megawatts of batteries by the end of 2025. There's no concrete legislation encouraging storage. There's a few decrees that require storage for projects above 1 megawatt, but that decree is implemented pretty loosely in the island. What's really moving things forward is PREB approving different storage plans that encourage hybrid systems and also standalone systems in the future. Dominican Republic, which is wraps up this top three, they have a decree, a resolution that requires storage with assets above 50 megawatts, solar assets above 50 megawatts. We've heard from developers and operators in Dominican Republic that the remuneration is still not very clear around storage assets, and there's also interconnection delays for storage assets, as well as minimal spreads in terms of when you charge and discharge your battery. So this has delayed some of the development in Dominican Republic, but we're still seeing some projects move forward, such as the Dominican Azul 99 megawatt hour project that broke ground earlier this year. If we move on to the next slide, please. So like I mentioned, the lack of regulation makes it very hard for investors to have a business case for storage in the region. Chile is really the only market that has made any significant strides in terms of storage. There's 338 megawatts of operational front-of-the-meter BESS projects. And, this is megawatts, not megawatt hours. So if you want to get the megawatt hour number, you got to multiply by around 3.5 to 3.8, which is the average duration of storage projects in Chile. In total, there's only 505 megawatts of operational BESS capacity in the region, and that's just 3% of the US front-of-the-meter market, which is expected to double in 2024. What this means is that Latin America is still light years behind the US, and there's a large untapped opportunity there as soon as regulation is implemented to encourage remuneration for storage assets. If we move on to the next slide, please. The reality is that all eyes are on Chile right now as this capacity payment comes closer. There's expectations that it will come out either in Q2 or Q3. And basically, it will provide BESS operators with contracted revenues estimated around $8 per kilowatt month. And that will supplement the roughly $100 per megawatt energy spreads that many of these battery storage operators see in the northern part of the country, where there's a lot of solar and 24/7 demand from mining companies. Once that contracted revenue is implemented, the expectation is that it will account for around 15% of the revenues for battery operators, while 85% will still come from energy arbitrage. Of course, that will change for each project, but the reality is that there's not much compensation or framework for ancillary services in Chile. So the two main revenue streams are going to be the capacity payment and the energy arbitrage spreads that operators will be maximizing. Here to the left, you see the top 5 IPPs with the largest BESS pipelines in Chile, starting with AES, who has a significant amount of operational, but also projects in construction and approved, followed by O Energy, Green Energy, Engie, and Colbún. As you see here, a lot of these projects are still in the announced phase. So they've been announced, but they haven't yet had an approval of their environmental license. In most cases, the environmental licenses in Chile are approved relatively fast because they don't need a environmental impact assessment, which is different than solar and wind projects, which can take anywhere from 12 months to 3 years for an EIA to be conducted. When we look at the operational assets in Chile, so 1.3 gigawatt hours, and we look at the pipeline at 33, there's a 25x difference. Of course, not all of this is going to materialize. There's high interest rates, there are interconnection delays, there's increased competition. which will either delay the construction of some of these assets or completely freeze and make them unfeasible. So there's a big pipeline, a big opportunity, but the 33 gigawatt that is planned is not necessarily going to materialize. If you look on to the next slide, here we show 4 different scenarios based on our own analysis. There's an ideal scenario according to the CEN, which is the energy system operator in Chile. And basically, they expect 13.2 gigawatt hours of storage by 2026 in an ideal scenario. Based on the pipeline and projects under construction and our own analysis, we expect in an optimistic scenario that around 10.7 gigawatt hours are going to be operational by 2026. There's a neutral scenario and a pessimistic scenario as well. It's likely going to fall somewhere between the neutral and the optimistic scenario, in our opinion. But what we're trying to show here is that even though there is this large amount of pipeline in Chile, it's still beneath what the system operator expects by 2026. The flattening of the duck curve is something that people talk about a lot in maturing storage markets. There's been talks about that in Chile and then eventually, not in Chile, in California, and eventually in ERCOT in Texas. But the reality is that this flattening of the duck curve takes a long, long time. California has over 40 gigawatt hours of storage already operational and still not seeing a flattening duck curve. Here in Chile, we have an optimistic scenario of 10.7, so 4x less than California. So we don't expect, of course, there's different factors in Chile, different loads and different size and scale, but we don't expect the duck curve to flatten until the end of the decade. The expected revenues, as I mentioned, 85% will come from arbitrage and around 15% will come from capacity. That is if there's no ancillary services market developed by 2026. But that's our expectation for what's going to happen. So now, with that overview, I'll turn over to the panel section of this webinar. A reminder to all of our participants that you can ask questions to any of us through the chat. We'll answer those live or via written text. As a brief introduction, Daniel Chacón, he's a sales and market director for LatAm in Fluence. Fluence is one of the biggest integrators for BESS around the world, and they're actually the market leader in Chile with over 1 gigawatt of contracted BESS capacity. Markus, he is the managing partner of New Charge Energy, which is a company providing software solutions and commercial and industrial storage solutions in Brazil. He's also the president of the advisory board of the Brazilian Storage Association. So he'll have a more detailed perspective about what's going on in Brazil, while Daniel will talk more about Chile and the region as a whole. Thank you both for being here. My first question is to Daniel. There is a lot of talk about storage across the region and across the world. It was actually the clean energy technology with the highest growth levels in 2023, according to the IEA, in terms of commercial operational technologies. What kind of opportunities do you see in Latin America in terms of size, in terms of duration, in terms of expected revenues, and ideal location? What's your view of the opportunities in the region?
Hey, Arthur, thank you for having me here, and thank you for the invitation to talk about energy storage in the region. Well, the expectations, I think you did a really good summary. The expectations that we have, as a solutions provider, is that Chile is going to continue being, the biggest market for our industry. Historically, Chile has had a lot of introduction of renewables, and so far is the country that has been the leader, and it's been on the front of the development of energy projects related to renewable sources, and that's what drives the introduction of energy storage projects as well. And that's the main reason why right now, most of the energy storage projects are located in Chile. Additionally, in Chile, so as everyone knows, there is a lot of solar generation and a lot of potential for solar generation in the north of the country. Is one of the areas in the world with the highest radiation, solar radiation, and that's also helping the business case for deploying more solar generation assets in the country. And again, the batteries and the energy storage projects is the perfect match for this type of market that they have in Chile. So just to answer your question, we expect to continue having a lot of opportunities, related to solar generation in the north of the country. Even though there are multiple projects, we see still a lot of opportunities to deploy more projects in that area of the country. Because of the current situation in Chile, most of the projects are in the range of 4 to 5 hours. I would say that's the expected duration, and the sizes of the project now are becoming bigger, right? The average project size in Chile is between 100 to 200 megawatts, of capacity, and again 4 to 5 hours of duration. So there will be a lot of competition, and there is a lot of competition already. The mining companies in the north of the country need to secure steady source of energy, and they are demanding most of these PPAs and off-taker contracts in the region. So there will be more activity for sure. And as you mentioned, during your summary, the companies and the projects that are able to be deployed, in the short term are going to, take advantage of the revenue recognition probably before, there is more competition in the market, and, the market becomes tighter. So just to summarize a little bit, Chile is going to continue being the front leader. And also in the Caribbean, we are seeing a lot of activity related to what you mentioned, the DR, Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico. And we are following very closely the markets in Mexico and Brazil. Those are called to be, big markets for any industry because of the size of the country and the demand of energy that they have. But so far they are behind, Chile and the Caribbean in terms of regulation. So that's, I would say a good summary of what we see in the region for the short term.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think it's very aligned with what we said in terms of DR, Puerto Rico, and Chile being the most attractive opportunities just because of where the regulation is in those countries. And what's interesting in Chile is that the batteries are so large because they're trying to take advantage of those large energy arbitrage spreads. When we look at other markets like the UK, where it's more focused on ancillary services rather than energy arbitrage, the batteries are not only smaller, but they also tend to be shorter duration, 1 to 2 hours, right? So it's an interesting difference between the two markets that I'd like to point. And in terms of Brazil, it's a market that is sort of getting started. There is a few behind the meter projects already running, maybe 1 or 2 small scale front of the meter projects that have been installed already. What's your vision on Brazil, Markus, and what kind of opportunities are you seeing in the storage space there?
Perfect. Well, Arthur and everyone who is joining us, good afternoon. It's a pleasure being around. I caught a little bit of flu this week, so I might be a little bit blurred, but I still hope that it's gonna make sense what I'm going to say. So with respect to energy storage, Brazil clearly is a nascent market. I mean, you showed a number of 30 megawatts of installed BESS. We did a survey last year. We found a slightly different number, a slightly larger number, but it's still very small. So basically, we mapped something around 100, 120 megawatt of BESS with an aggregate capacity of 300-ish megawatt hours, which is kind of ridiculously low. If you keep in mind that Brazil is the third largest electricity market in the Americas, with an annual consumption of something around 500 terawatt hours, and has a very, very quickly growing renewable sector. And you know, we can discuss a little bit as to why we are lagging behind. But I think if we look into the installed base today, we see a lot of small-scale energy storage being used for rural electrification. So basically, you know, literally, you know, one house systems which are being deployed by the utilities in remote areas of the Amazon region. That curiously constitutes about 2/3 of what we have right now with installed capacity. And then there is one very interesting project installed in São Paulo, in the state of São Paulo, which is a transmission relief project by ISA-CETEP, which is 60 megawatt hours. And then, as you rightly said, there is a bunch of, I'd say, first generation storage projects behind the meters. For example, the large mining company, Companhia Vale do Rio Doce, installed 10 megawatt hours in one of their terminals. You find a bunch of shopping centers, distribution companies and stuff. The first two pilot projects serving villages in the Amazon region or small towns, but it's very much in the making. And you know, if we look into the future, according to our analysis, we do see a market potential that, at least to us, looks fairly interesting. So we think that if everything works well, if we get the appropriate policy support, the appropriate tax policies in Brazil, could attract something around 25, 27 gigawatt hours by 2030. But there's a projection, of course, you know, with all the uncertainties. But there's definitely a lot of potential around. And what we see in terms of main opportunities in Brazil really is threefold. First and foremost, and you touched up on that on your previous slide, reserve capacity, and we can talk a little bit more about that. Secondly, decarbonizing remote towns in the Amazon region, remembering that we have about 200 municipalities, so literally towns which are not connected to the grid, and half of which will never be interconnected. And then we do have increasing economic feasibility for C&I. So I think these are the three main applications and main growth areas, and we can, you know, delve into every one of those as needed.
Great. That's very, very interesting, and I think that gives us a good overview. We'll talk a little bit more about the capacity auction, or the reserve auction that's expected later this year, and whether storage is going to be included in that auction. There's been comments by the Ministry of Energy that it will, but it's still relatively up in the air. Thank you all for the questions, by the way. We will get to those later in this discussion, but keep them coming. We'll definitely address them later on in this webinar. Back to you, Daniel. A question regarding expectations for Chile in 2024 and 2025. You guys reached an important milestone of 1 gigawatt of contracted BESS capacity. What's the expectation for this year and next year? Is it continued growth? And also, I'll take an opportunity to loop in a question from Ricardo Barreto, who said, any behind-the-meter wind plus BESS projects expected in Chile? Is that something you've seen, Daniel, in your experience there? And if so, under what revenue assumptions? I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Well, regarding the question about the behind-the-meter projects, right now, at least from Fluence, our main focus has been the utility scale projects and front-the-meter projects, and this is basically because of the volume, right? So sometimes, you know, it's difficult to focus on behind-the-meter projects if there is no enough volume, you know, committed to be able to focus on that specific project. So for the time being, and with the type of opportunities that we are seeing in Chile, I would say that we will continue focusing on utility scale projects. What happened in 2023 and also 2024, it's a combination of multiple things, I would say. In our case, I would say that we have been following projects. The projects that we've been able to secure are projects that we have been following from a very early stage. And also, during the recent months, the lithium and the battery prices have, lowered the price significantly. So that has activated, multiple projects because the business case now, makes more sense maybe than in the past. And I think the combination of those things, activated multiple projects. And going back to your question, so, globally, the energy market industry is growing, at a really, quick pace. It's sometimes, faster than we all can think about. And Chile is not the exception. So there will be continued growth, in the country. Right now, we have, every small, medium, and large company, that does, energy storage, trying to, capitalize all these opportunities. And it's not only on the supplier side, the IPPs and the developers are also doing their part, and that's, driving the growth of the energy industry in the country. So we foresee, more growth for 2025 and 2026. Actually, as you showed in your graphic, right? Right now, we only have about a gigawatt hour of operating systems, but we expect to have, I don't know, a growth that is 6 or 7 times, in the next 2 years, and we expect to have around 13 or 14 gigawatts, of operating systems by 2026. That's the most optimistic scenario, of course. But as you can see, the expectations are really high, and we are working towards that.
Yeah. Just quickly, yeah, I think the expectation is probably at an all-time high for Chile. The reality is, will they materialize now that interest rates are at the level that they are? Development costs are essentially higher because you take longer to get your permits approved. It's more complex. You got to pay guarantees to remain in the interconnection queue, and that costs money. And your cash flow is coming at a later date, right? Because your projects are getting delayed. So I think that's something that's already happening with solar and wind, especially more developed markets. It's growing perhaps not as quickly as expected. I think storage in Chile is still an exception because it doesn't really require an EIA unless there is a specific line that needs to be built. So I think it has that advantage, as well as the fact that there's not that much regulation around storage right now because it's so new. With solar and wind, that was the case as well in Chile until after the years, a new administration would add more regulation and new regulation and new regulation that it became so complex and is what's causing a lot of the delays that's happening right now. Daniel, I'll turn it back to you, but we have a couple of questions here on Brazil that I want to give Markus a chance to answer. One is from Kevin and one is from Rachel. From Kevin, it's what are the expectations for the Brazilian market given the country size compared to Chile, and the government auction that we mentioned that's about to happen later this year? Is there any expectation of when a storage normative or regulation will be applied in Brazil? And then from Rachel, what business model is meant with C&I for BESS? Markus, we've talked about a couple of different revenue opportunities with agricultural producers in the northeast of Brazil. Can you expand a little bit more on that as well?
Absolutely, and maybe we start with Rachel's question and then we go to the previous one. So when we talk about C&I users, we really talk about load shifting basically. So basically, you look at the transmission charges, which which obviously have different pricing depending on the hour of the day. So in Brazil, I guess, similar to what we see in other countries, we have peak prices between 6 p.m. And 9 p.m. It's always a 3-hour time frame. And if you look across the country, you find significant differences how big this delta is between off-peak and peak T&D charges. And in some locations, like in Rio, but also in northern Brazil, in Pará, and a couple of other states, that delta is large enough to basically make such projects viable, just by doing basically load shifting or peak shaving, if you want. Of course, there are upsides, if in the future energy storage were to be included into demand response programs, which already exist as classical demand response programs in Brazil, then that obviously could generate an upside. But I think it's firm to say that, especially with this recent decrease of capex prices that Daniel also mentioned, of the reductions that we have seen during the last year or so, CNI, also for large-scale CNI customers, which are sourcing their energy on the so-called free market, it is viable. Now, when you talk about agricultural, then the story is a little bit different. I mean, I think everybody knows that Brazil is a major agricultural commodity producer and exporter. And as a matter of fact, many regions basically in the inside of Brazil, where a lot of the soy and cotton, etc., productions are located, are regions which are not very well served by electric utilities. So there's a lot of what I would call repressed demand for electricity. And in some situations, you can make quite an interesting business case by basically coupling up an energy storage system with a solar PV system to power up, for example, those irrigation pivots or other operations, and substitute or at least reduce diesel generation. This is, I think, a very emerging sector. There's a handful of projects, and we have also done one of those, but a couple of other companies did as well. And working with agricultural customers is a little bit different than what you might be used when you work with classical CNI customers, but it's definitely a market that is existing. Now, maybe let's talk a little bit, if I may, Artur, about reserve capacity. So Brazil contracts reserve capacity through auctions in a framework that is not too dissimilar what we see in the UK or in Italy, for example. So basically, you contract reserve assets, you pay them a fixed monthly fee, and if you dispatch them, then they will be basically get paid whatever the spot market price is. And the first auction of that kind happened in 21, but, and that's a big difference both to UK and Italy, it was only directed to fossil plants. And so basically in 21, the government contracted something around 4.5 gigawatts of both new and retrofitted fossil power plants for reserve capacity, and will be paying those assets an annual fee of 812,000 reais per annum per megawatt. So that's something around depending on the exchange rate, 150, 160,000 US dollars per megawatt annum, which is, when you compare it to UK, to Italy, to Australia, relatively expensive. And I think this is something that caught our attention. Originally, reserve capacity was really thought to be a reserve capacity for critical moments. So the planning agency estimated that they will need this stuff for something around 120 hours per year, and that would be. Given the growth of solar and wind, especially of solar, this is changing. And so basically, Brazil right now has an evening ramp of around 20 gigawatts, which is just, the reduction of solar, the increase of consumption. So at some point between 5 p.m. and 8 p.m., somebody has to provide 20 gigawatts of additional power. This ramp will increase to something around 40 to 60 gigawatts in the next 3 to 4 years, which is basically due to not so much the growth of demand, but mainly due to the growth of solar distributed generation. And today, it's the large hydropower plants who are taking care of this ramp. Now, there are, of course, technical limits as to how much power you can push from those existing assets. There is no new hydropower development in Brazil. The last big power plant went online 10 years ago, and it was a flow of the river plant. The big plants with reservoirs are 30, 40 years old. So there's clearly a restriction as to what the hydropower, kind of the liquid battery, if you will, can provide. And I think this creates a perfect rationale for introducing BESS in a 3 to 4 hour product. As I mentioned before, these products are being sourced by auctions. And prior to each auction, there's always quite a lengthy public consultation phase where the ministry basically asks the market about what they think about the upcoming guidelines. So we got the guidelines for an auction which should happen later this year at some point between September and November, published in March. And contrary to some expectations, energy storage was excluded. But on reasons that were not really that solid. So for example, one of the arguments was, well, we don't yet have a regulatory framework. Well, guess what? If you contract hybrid power plants, the kind of things that Daniel has implemented in Chile, solar plus BESS, you are contracting a power plant, and we have all the regulatory framework in place for contracting power plants. So at least in the short term, the lack of a regulatory framework is not a sufficient excuse for excluding BESS. There are also some doubts about how to dispatch those things, how to create planning routines, but at the end of the day, all those are natural teething problems that can be solved. And what we right now, what we see is that the Minister of Energy, Alexandre Silveira, is kind of going back and forth. Some days he says that we're going to be part of it. Some days he is voicing doubts. We do feel a genuine interest to include BESS. Needless to say that there are interests against inclusion of BESS. I think that would be naive to suppose that everyone is in favor. Obviously not. But I think there's a real chance for this to happen. And the reason behind it, I think, is structural. And this is, I think, an important message that I wanted to bring across. Brazil is going to be long on electric energy over the next couple of years. Solar and wind, but especially solar, are growing so quickly that Brazil in 3 to 4 years will, during daytime, have something of 50 to 60 gigawatts of curtailment, which is like nearly the half of daytime peak demand, which is obviously terribly inefficient. Now, and so I think that the thing that people need to realize, and obviously this takes a little time to sink in, is that Brazil doesn't lack electricity. Especially, even in dry periods, the sun will still shine. Even if we have restriction on hydropower, we will still have solar, and we'll most probably have an abundance of wind. So Brazil doesn't lack electricity. What Brazil lacks is power, dispatchable power. And this is the reason why I think that why we think also this is one of the key topics that we are bringing forward through our association. Why we think that inclusion of BESS in the reserve capacity auction is not only important for us, obviously, but I truly believe it is something that is beneficial to the Brazilian electricity system. And it's normal that these discussions take some time and that we need to overcome doubts and questions and criticism. I think this is all part of the game. And to the extent possible, we are just playing that game and supporting the decision makers in the government to come up with reasonable guidelines.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. I think it's clear that there's many benefits to BESS being included in this reserve auction, but there's several interests at play, and it's hard to predict what politicians will decide. It's interesting that there's going to be such an increase in the ramp over the years from 20 gigawatts to 40 to 60, and that's just because of distributed generation. The amount of distributed generation in the country. But I also think it's interesting that there's so much new electricity demand that is likely to also start becoming an issue because of AI and the need to have massive data centers to process all this AI systems. We're already seeing this in all the projections in the US with different utilities increasing their loads by 3 to 5x. And I think it's going to happen in Latin America, probably not at the scale that we're seeing in the US, and probably going to happen, a few years later. But that's also something that BESS will have an important role to play. And just shifting now back to you, Daniel. There's a lot of competition. We know that in Chile, right? There's Chinese players, there's Sungrow, there's Fluence, of course, there's Wärtsilä, there's Siemens, there's several different players operating in the BESS, only in the integration market, right? There's of course other players in other parts of the value chain. What are utilities and IPPs looking for from integrators? Is it really just a cost, or is it reliability? Is it experience? We've seen recently the Biden administration impose pretty massive tariffs on lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles, which will apply for lithium-ion batteries for non-electric vehicles, so for stationary storage systems as well in 2 years. I know it's still very early, but how is the competition in the Chilean market? Is there significant downward pricing pressure from the Chinese? And what's your experience with all of that?
No, you're right. And yes, as I mentioned before, a big market also brings competition, right? And the energy storage industry is an industry where there are multiple players. You named them all, or some of them already. So I would say IPPs and utilities, in general, as a general comment, all of them look for the perfect combination between competitiveness and price, and also high quality products and services. What we do, and what's been our main characteristic, as a provider in the market, is that we try to go one step ahead of that. Of course, competitiveness is expected in every single project, and the high quality is also something that every customer demands. What we try to do different is to become a partner for these utilities and these IPPs, and we are able to take risk from them, and we can handle that risk efficiently. So I think that's at least what we try to do from our position as a supplier, as a key supplier in the market. Every company has a different risk profile, and some companies will focus a lot on price. Some others will focus on the experience that that Fluence, for example, could have in the country, and all the focus that we have in the best projects, because that's the core of our business. We focus 100% in the best projects, so we don't get distracted by other business units around our company. So I think it's such a big market that it'll be unfair to classify all the IPPs and the developers under just one specific category of what they are looking for. But in general, I would say those are the key drivers. Another thing to mention is that yes, of course, the competition drives the prices down, and not only the competition in the country. Again, speaking a little bit more generally, or from the global perspective, the lithium, as I mentioned before, the lithium prices are going down. The energy storage market also competes with the EV market, so it depends on how that balances, and if there is enough demand from the EV market, then it may be difficult to find batteries for the stationary storage projects. I would say the key for us at Fluence has been to be able to secure supply, and securing supply from our tier one suppliers of cells and batteries allow us to be competitive on the arena in the country. but also allows us to plan for the future. So we can, plan for, projects that are, a year ahead, 2 years ahead of now, or even, later on in the schedule. So I think, it's a combination of multiple things, but in general, I would say that's what the market demands. And as the market grows, of course, the market becomes more sophisticated. So the customers, the IPPs, the utilities, are now developing multiple projects. So of course, the first project is usually the most complex one, but the second and the third, there will be more lessons learned to implement in the projects, and the skill sets are being developed as we speak. So Chile is becoming a very sophisticated market, and that also, is part of the competitiveness that I'm talking about. It's not only price; it's a combination of multiple things, and I think that's what we should expect, for the near future in Chile. That's going to drive a lot of innovation, also on the technology side and the application of the batteries. One thing that we haven't talked much about, but is about the applications of the batteries. So right now, I would say 90 to 95% of the projects that we are looking at we are looking in the region are related to either generation sources, collocated with solar plants or wind farm plants. Now standalone is becoming like a thing for Chile, for example. But we also have transmission applications. The transmission lines are getting more congestion because of the multiple sources of generation, and because of the instability of the energy renewable assets, and the batteries are being also used to solve issues related to transmission. So that's even, I would say, farther away in the timeline. We still have a lot of generation projects, standalone projects, but I would say transmission is going to be the big next thing. Once we are over these applications, and again, Chile is becoming a more sophisticated market for energy storage, and the IPPs and the utilities are learning and developing all the skill set. So they are also becoming more sophisticated in terms of the technical requirements, and and the things that they request in order to adjust to their risk profile that every company has.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about the EV supply and demand compared to lithium ion battery prices. And many people say that the main reason behind such a fall in lithium ion prices is because there was this ramp up in capacity of lithium batteries for EVs, and EVs are going through somewhat of a slump. So this oversupply is causing a fall in battery prices. It'll be interesting to see as EVs ramp up back again, which is inevitable, how that's going to impact battery prices for fixed storage. A couple of questions here that I'll answer quickly. One from Luis Costa about revenues in Chile and how the expectation on arbitrage. And yes, as more storage is installed, there's going to be less spreads, less arbitrage. And the expectation is that the capacity payment that's supposed to come out in the next couple of quarters will take up a bigger chunk of revenues. Right now, energy arbitrage accounts for 100% or nearly 100% of revenues. That's going to fall to 85% in the next 2 years, and is likely going to keep falling as more batteries installed. So the strategy is pretty simple. You got to maximize those spreads right now, really use your batteries to the max to take advantage of those large spreads that are particularly present in the north of the country. One question here, back to Markus. It's clear that Brazil is slightly behind the curve, especially when considering the regulation in Chile and the installed operational capacity already in Chile. One thing that is top of mind is the import taxes that batteries suffer basically because it's a protectionist market. You know, Brazilian battery systems may cost 70% more just because of the different taxes that are tagged on to different components. While in the US, it's the complete opposite, right? You can get up to a 70% investment tax credit if you're operating in specific communities and providing prevailing wage. You know, it's how do you compete in a market where the IRA exists and there's such attractive incentives? How do you compete in a market like Brazil?
I think that's a great question. I think it also ties into what Steve wrote on our chat, where he's asking to which extent the Ministry of Mines and Energy and ANEEL, the regulatory agency, are kind of responsible for this delay. But let's talk about taxes. I mean, obviously, if you look at Brazil from a global level, you say you're in a global solution provider like Fluence or a global funds provider, then Brazil wouldn't come up to your mind right now, simply because, as you rightly said, there are so many other great opportunities to chase right now. Now, this doesn't mean that the country doesn't have potential. As I said, I think there is a very interesting potential, and those who are willing to basically develop a position in Brazil clearly will have an advantage, because it's not an easy country to operate. It's a country that, as you rightly said, is relatively shielded. So I do think that we do not have the same level of competition intensity that you see somewhere else. Now, unfortunately, Brazil is a protectionist country, as you rightly said. If we add up all the 4 taxes which are applicable to energy storage systems, which is an importation tax and tax on industrialized products, a social contribution tax, and then value-added tax, and effectively you end up something around 70%, which is like total bogus. There's no denying. There are some ways how to optimize and engineer that. For example, there are tax exemptions for infrastructure projects to the extent that the BESS would be part of a transmission project or a generation project. You could take out some 12 to 15 percentage point of those 70, and then there are some other things that you can do. But clearly the situation is not satisfactory, and it's weird because renewable energy, so all the capital goods related to renewable energy, be it panels, inverters, wind turbines, you name it, have been enjoying very far-reaching tax exemptions. And by the way, so have been many other capital goods in the electricity sector, like gas turbines and its components. And it's clearly one of the main asks that we are putting forward as an association to change that. And you know, one of the things that we always explain to the government is that right now it's a lose-lose situation, because if we had a different tax treatment, then obviously many more projects would become viable, and then, you know, the guys in Brasilia would collect more taxes and we would have more business. In all honesty, I think this is something that will evolve. As always, it just takes time. And I think our biggest challenge, and I think this is not exclusive to Brazil, is that those public administrations just take for ages to get things done. Definitely. And also coming back to the question that was asked about the ministry and ANEEL, yes, they are behind. I mean, we can debate whether they are very delayed or just delayed. They are behind. I think the discussion now has gained a degree of visibility that we didn't have 1 or 2 years ago. And so I'm fairly optimistic that in later this year, early next year, ANEEL will finally release their regulatory resolution for energy storage. We are working intensively with the ministry both on reserve capacity and also off-grid auctions for the Amazon region. I think things will move on, and maybe by the time that Chile and other countries have become matured and commoditized and less exciting than they are right now, because right now those are very exciting markets, of course. Maybe by then, in 3-4 years, Brazil is going to be the next hotspot where people will be focusing their attention to.
I think the question is not if, but when in Brazil, right? It's
Yeah,
gonna
that's the point.
happen.
That's the point.
It's
That's the point,
gonna
exactly.
happen. We just don't know exactly when. I remember tracking a telecom policy bill for 5 years, just because it just wouldn't get approved in the Brazilian legislature. So these things take time. It's a lot of horse trading politics in Brazil. There's a lot of coalitions and interests involved. It's not easy. Mexico, just touching upon Mexico a little bit, there's been a lot of behind the meter opportunities because there's some demand charges that make it attractive for battery operators, and some interesting spreads. But the reality is that there is no official regulation for front of the meter storage projects. That could change with the election of the next administration. Scheinbaum, who's leading the polls, is more open to renewables than AMLO, which is not very hard to do. But she has higher renewable energy targets, has talked about being more open to private sector investment, and kind of accelerating this renewable energy adoption. And we, Daniel and I, were talking earlier today that there is a draft. I don't know if it's a legislation or a decree of sorts that would provide clear remuneration for storage projects in Mexico. This is just a draft, and it's unlikely that it will materialize until a next administration is in place. But it shows that there are talks and there is interest from different parties in establishing a framework for storage in Mexico. Just to sort of wrap up here, one question for you, Daniel, and back to you, Markus, to concluding remarks. Chile, there's a huge expectation for this capacity payment based on the duration of your batteries. You have a derating factor. I think it's 98% if it's a 4-hour battery and 35% if it's 1 hour. What's your expectation for this legislation? I know there's a lot of unknowns when it will be approved, but what's your expectation? What's the feeling of the market around this legislation?
Yeah, I would say that definitely, what's going to happen is that many projects that are, on a standby, waiting for this capacity payment to be confirmed, will be activated. The customers would be able to get finance based on actual, an actual, number or an actual, capacity payment that is going to be published and public for everyone. So that's going to activate a lot of standalone projects, in my opinion. And as I said at the beginning, right, those projects that are deployed, faster or at the beginning would be able to materialize, that opportunity in the short term. So I would say, that's going to increase the opportunities and the chances of deploying energy storage in the country.
Absolutely. I would agree completely with that. I think the market's going to keep growing regardless of the capacity payment. If for some reason it doesn't become published, which is not the expectation, but if for some reason that happens, it's going to keep growing, but with a contracted revenue portion, plus these large arbitrage spreads, it's going to become very attractive to install both standalone and hybrid projects in Chile. Markus, back to you. We've talked a lot about Brazil, where it stands. If you had to look in your crystal ball, is storage going to be included in this reserve auction expected for this year? What kind of percentage is how sure are you? And if it is included, is it likely to win the auction as a hybrid project standalone? What's your expectations for that?
Yeah, so my crystal ball told me to shut up because I've been asking it far too often. This question. No, but in all honesty, I think the chance of getting included into this year's auction is maybe a 50-50 chance, because simply not because of a lack of interest or lack of goodwill, but simply because the timing is very tight. So the ministry wanted to have this auction in August, before they can do it, they legally have to run 2 more public consultations on that, put forward a bunch of documents and directives. And quite honestly, with or without batteries, I doubt that they will have time to put this on the street in time. So if the auction gets pushed back into the last quarter, I think we will have sufficient time to discuss and support the ministry in getting reasonable guidelines. But if not, I think the structural arguments and the structural necessity for including batteries is here. As I said, we are going to be long on energy. We are having huge curtailment problems, especially in Northeast, with solar, similar to what guys are facing in Atacama. The transmission network is not able to follow the growth of renewable sources. DG, despite all the changes in the regulation, continues to grow like crazy. And so I think the structural factors that you need to justify batteries and reserve capacity, they are here. And for us, we say it's an important effort that we're doing right now to explain the advantages, to help the decision makers to formulate a reasonable public policy that has to be done anyway. If you're lucky, we're going to be part this year. If we are less lucky, we're going to be part in the next auctions. But I think the probability of batteries being included in the near future is very high. And I was thinking the other day, with solar back in 2014, it wasn't too different. Mm-hmm. There were years of discussions and back and forth and good news and bad news, and at some point, oops, suddenly solar was included. And I think it is not going to be much different here. And just to wrap up, and not wanting to monopolize, but there are other interesting auctions which are worth keeping an eye on, at least for those people with some sense of adventure. As I mentioned in my initial speech, we have more than 100 towns in the Amazon regions which will never be interconnected. Those towns are being served by IPPs today, and those contracts are also being contracted in auctions. And there's a clear movement to go towards hybridization, because all of this power generation today comes from fossil fuels, which is kind of a very problematic thing, of course. So I think this is another interesting opportunity for both, actually, for solar and for BESS to play a role in innovating the Brazilian electricity system. Absolutely. I think what we've learned from working the energy space for a while now is that all the projections are usually wrong. It's usually much larger growth. It's something that's not expected. So it's a hard space to be someone that forecasts. Let me tell you something, and I think this is something that I've been observing in Brazil several times. The country is always late. I mean, Brazil has never been an early adopter, unless you speak about, certain musics and certain sports and stuff. But in terms of energy and technology, the country has never been an early adopter. So it takes forever, but when it happens very, very quickly. Correct. So Brazil went from like 0 to the average Brazilian having 2 cell phones in a couple of years. We went to 0 distributed generation to nearly 30 gigawatts in, I think, 3 or 4 years, something like that. Same with wind. And so when things happen, they happen very, very quickly. And I think this is going to be the same here. And I think it's, what my crystal ball tells me, that this is a marathon. Hopefully it's not an Ironman. Hopefully it's only a marathon. So you need to have a lot of patience. You need to have a lot of stamina. But due to those underlying structural reasons, I think it's going to be worthwhile. And DG has grown in Brazil for different reasons than it has in Europe or in the United States. But it has grown tremendously. And I think the same is going to be true for storage. We will be growing for different reasons, but of course I'm suspect to say that, but I'm fairly convinced that there is a solid rationale for this happening. Absolutely. Yeah. No, the DG growth was incredible. A lot of it was because of exemptions on the transmission tariffs. So it was incentives that encouraged that, as well as very good payback periods. It could get paid back in 5 years or less, which is pretty fast. But the point is, even now that they are charging the T&D charges, it's still very good. So there's literally the payback for an on-site system went from 3 to 6 years. Wow. You know, this is not a dramatic decrease of attractiveness. And the thing is, this thing always has this red priority. So there is no way, and I think this is the big point of concern for the grid operator, for ONS. There is no way how to switch off DG, obviously. There is no technical basis. So this thing, those 30 gigawatts that probably will become 40 in in the very soon future, they will always be dispatched. And they are creating an increasing amount of challenges in the day-to-day operations. And for that, for us, this is perfect. Yeah,
exactly. I realize that we're over time, and I know there's still pending questions. We'll get to those questions in writing. If you want to ask any of us any specific questions, feel free to reach out on LinkedIn as well. But I want to thank all of you for your time, especially the panelists, Markus and Daniel. It's been a super interesting conversation. I hope everyone's learned as much as I did, and looking forward to keeping this conversation going. Thank you very much, everyone. Take care.